Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. The HiT cast offers a weekly look at Hollywood from a conservative point of view. Sick of media bias infecting Hollywood headlines? Tired of stars insulting your views? HiT has your back. Now, here's your host, Christian Toto.
Welcome to episode 94 of the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. This week we're speaking with radio legend Anthony Cumia. You know him from his Opie and Anthony days, but now he broadcasts 4 times a week, courtesy of his self-owned Compound Media. His new book, Permanently Suspended, reveals not just his career, but the evolution of both radio and broadcasting. It's a pretty great read. This week's show is sponsored by Beto O'Rourke for President, a chicken in every pot and a skateboard at every campaign stop. Actor Viggo Mortensen interrupted his career this week to offer a heartfelt apology. Did he punch someone over a parking spot? Cover up for a movie mogul's sexual assaults? No. He used the N-word, the full N-word, while discussing his oh-so-progressive new film about race. Confused? Well, welcome to 2018. Mortensen co-stars in a new movie called Green Book. It's factually based about a white driver and his bond with a black musician during the racially charged 1960s. During the press push for the film, the actor mentioned how, back then, people casually used the N-word in conversations. Except he actually said the N-word full. And he's white. So that is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. Does context matter here? Of course not. You could use the N-word as a curse, a slur, or you can just carefully, methodically describe history. It's all the same. You'll be in trouble. Now, the actor just cut off the outrage police at the pass by releasing his own statement on the issue. Here we go. In making the point that many people casually used the N-word at the time in which the movie's story takes place in 1962, I used the full word. Although my intention was to speak strongly against racism, I have no right to even imagine the hurt that is caused by hearing that word in any context, especially from a white man. I do not use the word in private or in public. I am very sorry that I did use the full word last night and will never utter it again. Never? Not even in the privacy of your house? Can he still think it? Can you hear how creepy this is? Does anyone think that he harbors any ill will towards black people in any way, in any context? Of course not. But he silenced himself, released an apology that sounded like they were holding his dog backstage and forcing him to say what they wanted him to say. Oddly enough, it's something Anthony Cumia would rail about in his podcast. He may have already by the time this show airs. And he should, and other radio shows and podcasters should too. Today, you have to tread oh so carefully, or the outrage police will come for you. And of course, they'll ignore other people like the aforementioned Alec Baldwin, whose name wasn't mentioned, but you knew exactly who I was talking about that parking spot violation. Do the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, step on the toes of the PC police, and you'll be doing your own creepy apology too.
You're listening to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment.
We have an extra treat this week. I interviewed Jim Culver from threedonia.com about 2 important cultural stories that fit perfectly with this podcast. You know, I've been reading Jim's work for a while now on that site, and I really like what he has to say. He's a pretty smart observer of pop culture, Hollywood, certainly leans to the right, but has some really good takes on things. So I hope you enjoyed this bonus feature. Well, Jim, you've got a couple of news stories you wanted to comment on, and I think they're both perfectly applicable to the HiT cast, and also I want to get your unique take on them. So let's start with Disney and Star Wars and what's going on in the news, and why do you think the media narrative may be a little askew in this arena?
Sure. So, as anyone who's kind of been paying attention knows, Star Wars kind of started out strong in terms of profitability, but they've been dropping off lately. The movies are making less and less money, and the last one, Solo, actually lost money. I think it took a loss of around $200 million. So, Disney's not doing well. but it's woke Disney, it's woke Star Wars, so of course the media has to cover for it and make it look good, make it look like this pays. So CNBC recently put out an article claiming that Disney had already made back enough money to turn a profit on the $4 billion that they paid for the franchise to George Lucas. But there's a lot of dishonesty in that article. I mean, it essentially conflates box office gross with profitability, which is not even close to the same thing. Mm-hmm. The films have grossed $4.8 billion, which is obviously more than the $4 billion they paid for the franchise. But after you take out all the production costs to make them, the marketing and distribution costs, splitting ticket sales with theaters, and of course deduct what Solo lost, it comes out to a profit of around $1.3 billion, which is only a fraction of what they paid for it, and that's before taxes.
Yeah.
What's interesting about this is I think there's two things going on. I think in our culture there is this kind of cheering section for two things. One is the woke nature of the whole saga, which makes my heart bleed as we speak.
Right.
But also
right.
I think there's sort of there's almost an energy behind Star Wars now. Like, it's so cool, it's so hip, it's so big, it's such a monolith that we have to kind of rally behind it. I almost feel that when the early reviews for franchise movies start kind of tweaking out there, because I don't know, there's just a sense that you have to keep the momentum going and that they can't stall. They can't be allowed to stall. I don't know. Do you get that at all as far as the media? Like, it's almost like they're invested in the enormity of these franchises?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there have been no articles about the profitability of Marvel that I've seen on CNBC or any other big franchise right now. This is the only one they decided to cherry pick. And, this is the only one that's gone all in on identity politics. With The Last Jedi. So, but as that happened, the profitability's dropped off. And so there's a real sense that articles like this are trying to prop it up and make it seem like a good bet, so that other studios go in on these same kind of identity politics agendas.
What's interesting about Star Wars right now is that there's been a lot of things announced. I don't know how many will go forward. I guess the Boba Fett film is collapsing, and yet there's a new Rogue One prequel with Diego Luna, and then there's also possibly a new series led by the Game of Thrones team and a new series led by the Rian Johnson, who directed Last Jedi. I mean, talk about flooding the market. I feel like part of the wonder of Star Wars was it felt special and unique, and you didn't get a new Star Wars saga every 5 minutes. I mean, I think this alone may kill the franchise. What's your take? Am I wrong? Is there something maybe that can be gleaned positively out of this? What's your take on that?
Well, I think first of all, you're absolutely right. They, as I said, they're a long way off from making their money back on this, and so they're trying to be as ubiquitous as they can while this is a hot property, so that they can make that profit back. So, but the trilogies are on the back burner. Boba Fett is canceled. The Obi-Wan movie is canceled. So all they have right now is Episode 9, and they have a couple of TV shows that will probably do well, but not enough to make back another $3 billion. Obviously the excuse here is that you're running into what they call franchise fatigue, where you just get tired of seeing the same thing over and over again. And certainly that is a real thing. But, at the same time, Marvel has made 20 movies in the last 10 years, not counting, spinoffs like Eddie Brock and things, Venom and things like that. But nobody's gotten tired of them. I mean, the two biggest movies this year were Black Panther and Infinity War. So, the franchise fatigue, it exists, but it isn't guaranteed. I mean, usually it happens if the movies become lackluster or if they get tainted by identity politics, in this case, that drives people away, something divisive like that.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think the superhero fatigue that I've been waiting for about 8 years is not even remotely here. I mean, the fact that Venom, which is a very mediocre movie, is killing it at the box office means that anything superhero related is still gold. And I don't think we're burnt out there, but I do agree. Yeah, I think the product of Star Wars is where the issue comes into play, and they got to be very careful.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, the thing about Star Wars is, I mean, there's a gigantic universe to play with there, much bigger than Marvel or DC has. And, there's an entire galaxy, but they just keep going back to the same storylines, the same characters, the same themes. And so that's part of where it's not really franchise fatigue. I think it's just storyline and character fatigue, because they're kind of recycling the same things. But instead of keeping the things that we liked about them, they're adding in things that we don't like. Star Wars was never about identity politics, and it was never about demographics or things like that. It was just about, heroism and magic. It's kind of a sci-fi fairy tale. You have magic and princesses and heroes and all these things, and lightsaber dual sword fights. And so, it kind of taps into that part of our brain that loves those things, fairy tales and heroism and things like that. So to kind of strip all that out and then put in this, these dreary identity politics and unpleasant characters and things like that, it's just it just kind of spoils that. And then on top of that, they're not giving us any really fresh storylines. So they have a whole universe to explore, but they're not doing it. Yeah. So if they could fix both those problems, I think they could keep making Star Wars movies ad infinitum, and people would keep going because they'd be worth seeing.
Yeah, and look at the Marvel films this year. Ant-Man and the Wasp and Black Panther couldn't be more different. Loved them both, and they're both successful, and they're both part of that universe. But it's flexible enough to kind of tell those two very different kinds of stories while still being superhero films. So that's a great point. I want to switch gears before we let you go about another article which kind of made me go sigh or roll my eyes or even both, talking about the violence in superhero movies and the good guys versus the bad guys. Maybe you can explain more from there.
Right. So this was a study that came out of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I think the main thrust of it was just to discuss the glorification of violence in our culture and things like that. But basically, it studied superhero movies over the last 10 years, mostly Marvel and DC, and looked at the acts of violence and determined that heroes commit more acts of violence than villains do per hour. They counted the numbers of violence per hour. And so based on that, it seemed to conclude that heroes were more violent than villains. But, obviously there's some big problems with this. It doesn't take any context into account. For example, the obvious fact that superheroes were doing what they're doing for heroic reasons, usually usually in self-defense and usually to save innocent people. So, there was no context there. And obviously for storytelling purposes, the heroes kind of have to commit more acts of violence because they have more to overcome. They have a bigger struggle. The villains usually have more henchmen to fight and things of that nature. So, there's just no context involved there. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, if you just look at acts of violence, without any context, I mean, if you can look at World War II and say that the average Allied soldier
That's right.
Committed more acts of violence personally than Adolf Hitler did, but who's the good guy and who's the bad guy here? It's it's pretty obvious. So it's you have to have some context in here, and so it's effectively a sin of omission. And I'm seeing this article this study shared by all kinds of liberal sources, and so I think what they're kind of trying to say with it is that there's some kind of moral relativism where they the heroes or the good guys are just as bad or worse as the bad guys, just as violent. It's the same kind of moral relativism you see with police and military all the time. Is they're just as bad as the bad guys, just as bad military is just as bad as the terrorists, or whatever, however you want to frame it. But that seems to be the main point being made is that this is trying to push that kind of moral relativism on superheroes by ignoring all of the moral context behind what they're doing.
I'm sure that Marvel will completely ignore the study, as well they should. One last
Right.
question about it. In the reporting of this study, did they mention the context as well? I mean, I appreciate the fact that you're doing it right here, right now, but did some of those articles say, oh, and by the way, they're the good guys, they're the focus of the movie, they're trying to save X, Y, and Z? Was that context put in there, or was it more of a flat, here are the facts, the study said this, and we're moving on from there?
Well, if anything, it was more simplistic than that. They went by the protagonist of the film rather than versus the antagonist. So, in some cases, they included Suicide Squad, they included Deadpool, films where the hero isn't really a hero, is more of an anti-hero or even arguably a villain. So that's more context that was ignored.
Yeah. I'm just amazed that that the study even went forward, and someone, I'm sure they worked very hard to make this study, but it just seemed like the whole premise seemed, if not flawed, a little silly. But any last words, Jim, before I let you go?
No, I mean, just these two articles are just examples of how the media pushes certain narratives and props up certain entertainment franchises they want to prop up while ignoring others. I mean, it's just mainly sins of omission in both cases. So that's just always something to look out for when you're looking at the media. But just any amount of thought kind of quashes their narrative in about 5 minutes. So
yeah, a great point. And that's what I do a lot, both on my website and this podcast, is talk about the media, because you can't talk about entertainment without bringing the media in, and often in an unflattering way, but they bring it on themselves. Jim, for people who want to read some of your writing, they can check out threedonia.com. There'll be a link to that site. It's a wonderful site on the show notes page at hollywoodintoto.com. And I appreciate your help, and we'll check in with you again.
Don't touch that dial. You're listening to my daddy's podcast.
Here's the hit tweet of the week. Oh, it's Ellen Barkin's craziest Twitter week ever. And it was really hard to pick just one to focus on. Now, one of her tweets got a lot of attention in the media. I'm not going to talk about that one. I want to kind of dig a little deeper and find something new. Here it is. It's her reaction to the infantile, hopelessly biased Jim Acosta getting banned from the White House. After today, Trump will try to ban many more. Hashtag Hitler's son. No, wait a minute. He went from Hitler to worse than Hitler in the Washington Post, and now he's Hitler's son? I'm confused. My hit tip of the week is being evil. Evel Knievel, that is. As a boy, I was completely mesmerized by Evel Knievel. I don't even remember exactly why. I knew about him. I heard about him. I even had that crank-up toy. You wind it up, and his motorcycle just spins off it. And in a way, I think I'm still fascinated by Evel Knievel. This documentary helps explain why. It's the fame, it's the fortune, the broken bones. He lived this amazing, crazy life. And I had to think while watching it, even just talking about it now, what would Evel Knievel be like in 21st century? Would he be on Twitter? Would he be even more outrageous? Or, just given how crazy modern life is, maybe he wouldn't even resonate today. But he sure as heck resonated during the 70s and 80s. It's an amazing life. It's captured with a real straightforward vision, and I think that's the right approach when you got a subject matter that's this unconventional. Don't go crazy, don't go surreal, just tell it like it is. Now, Knievel was a pretty complicated guy, but I think he really understood Americans and the American psyche better than most people. It's one of the reasons why he risked his life over and over again, and why I just was so completely fascinated by him as a kid. But even if you didn't grow up with Evel Knievel in your life in some way, I think you'll still enjoy Being Evil. Available now on Amazon Prime. Now let's get to this week's HitCast interview. Anthony Cumia was the quintessential shock jock, and he has all those pink slips to prove it. Today, the former Opie and Anthony star hosts his own podcast on his very own podcasting network, Compound Media. Just try firing him, you can't. But how did he go from a working stiff to one of radio's biggest stars? And why couldn't he hold on to gig after gig despite all that talent and his massive fan base? Well, it's all in his new memoir, Permanently Suspended. Anthony shares more about his career and why it's so darn scary to speak the truth in 2018. Here's my chat with the legendary Anthony Cumia. You know, Anthony, you were the guy in the car driving to work, hated his job, and then you became the guy who made that drive even better for some people. The book describes how that happened, the steps you took, but just kind of internally, it's not always so easy to make that transition to kind of go for your dreams. What do you think was the sort of the driving force that made you take those steps in the first place?
Oh, it was absolutely a hatred of real work. Like, that was a real job where I had to get up early. It was manual labor, and I would look at guys that were my age now back then, And I just couldn't imagine doing that. I couldn't imagine being that guy in my 50s, actually climbing a ladder and swinging a hammer and things like that. I knew I had to do something else. So that was really the drive behind pursuing some way out of the actual working world. It wasn't that I was lazy. Although I was, but that wasn't it as much as it was just I felt like I should have been doing something else besides swinging that hammer and using those tin snips.
I've been listening to your show now, and two things jumped out at me right away. You're having a very good time, obviously. And it's also, I almost didn't recognize the kind of content because it was male. It was sort of macho in a way. It expressed thoughts that you just don't talk about these days in our PC age. And I was kind of curious, do you think that other broadcasters are afraid to kind of go there at this point, to be male in our Me Too era? I mean, it seems so surreal to hear the conversations that you're having. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, you just don't hear that much anymore.
No, you don't. And I don't think it's because people don't have that want or need to talk like that, to be open and honest and make jokes about anything and everything, and have real discussions about real issues that make people uncomfortable. I don't think people want to shy away from that. I think they've been forced by the PC culture we've been living in for quite a few years now. Out of fear. People are petrified of losing everything they have, their career, their reputation, because it can happen. People have seen too much of it. So we're under this dark cloud of censorship that's almost self-imposed. It's such a strange thing. When years ago we would talk about Big Brother, 1984 kind of Orwellian world, we always assumed it would be this government entity and these floating orbs that are watching your every move. And it turns out that we ourselves, the people ourselves, are the rats. We're the ones following each other around. Can't wait to rat someone out with our phone and our camera in order to make them an unperson. And people are, and rightly so, petrified that they can lose everything by saying the wrong thing. And by wrong thing, I mean being honest and open and sarcastic and funny. And, everything's taken at such face value these days. People forget that humor takes on a bunch of different forms. And sometimes it can be very uncomfortable and sarcastic, but people don't seem to see that these days. But yeah, I think a lot of people want to express themselves, but again, they're frightened of losing everything.
Your book talks about your life story growing up, your career, transitioning from radio to podcasting, but it also is that story as well, where the culture is evolving and changing. Do you think there was a sort of a moment in time where the culture evolved, or has it been sort of a slow process where even comedians have to watch what they say like a politician?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of both. It kind of started off slow, that proverbial frog in the slowly boiling pot of water, where, you kind of thinking, well, it's not that bad, or how bad could it get, kind of a thing. And then there was this rapid acceleration over the past few years where people really started cracking down. People saw other people in the entertainment business, especially, just being crucified and exiled from the business because they decided to open their mouths and speak about something. So yeah, I think it was a combination of the two. But when it happened fast, it happened fast. And I've seen a lot of comics over my years with the O&A show and now with my show that I remember as being very open-minded, very funny, and cutting edge, that have tamed it way down and pulled way back because again, they fear their careers, and rightly so. I don't blame anybody for not wanting to put themselves on the cross, because it's very hard to come back from. So that's kind of the climate we're living under right now. And it is disheartening, though, to see some of these comics that I know for years and years that have reined it way back because they're afraid.
People thought that with President Trump's election that he was sort of the antidote to that he was the response to that, and that it would change, and it hasn't changed. Are you hopeful that there is if not an end in sight, a walk back? The fact that maybe enough people get fed up with that climate where it changes, or are we not nearly there yet?
Yeah, I'd like to see it, of course. And I every so often I think I see a light at the end of the tunnel. You know, I'll kind of look overall or see somebody say something and they kind of get away with it. And I'm like, oh, maybe we're past all this, or we're getting past it. And then, a sledgehammer just comes down on something, and it reinforces my thoughts that we are still in the thick of it. I think Trump has helped in this weird way. I know a lot of people are offended by what he says. They don't think he's presidential. But to see somebody in such a position of power speaking so openly about things, it makes me feel kind of good that maybe we can get through this, because this isn't. I'm not trying to be a patriot here. I'm more an entertainer with a lot of self-interest in the whole thing. But I think America is about conversation and dialogue, and whether it's done comedically or seriously, you can't take what somebody's saying and have a conversation with somebody and then turn them in to the thought police, pretty much, and end their livelihood and end their reputation. And we see it happen all the time. Conversation should be met with conversation. If something offends you, you should be able to debate that in a way where people could go, wow, that person made a valid point, and now I see why they were upset or offended. Not try to shut that person down and remove what they have said from history. We've seen it happen in history, and it's not pretty. It doesn't end nicely.
Yeah, Andrew Breitbart said more voices, not less. Your new memoir talks about your old partner, Opie, and I was kind of curious. You're often very generous to him. You're often very critical of him. Was that the hardest part of the book to write, or were there other chapters or pieces that really challenge you as a memoir writer?
I would agree with that. Very good observation. It was a difficult part to write in certain ways, and I do want to give him the credit for bringing me on board. Like I said, I was in construction. I had no experience in radio, even though I'd been in bands and I have done radio shows before, but never as a steady job. And for him to bring somebody so inexperienced on board as an equal is quite the undertaking. And I give him massive credit for that, and I will always be indebted to him for that. After 20 years, wow, you really start, like, anything and everything that people do, and I'm sure he feels the same way about me or Jim Norton, starts annoying you. It's just the way it is. And that started happening. And there were other things, though, that went a little deeper than just that long-term relationship of a radio partnership and things annoying you. There were certain things that were important, not trivial, that happened between the two of us that I think were kind of irreparable at that point, from respect issues and girlfriends and wives and things like that come into the mix that kind of upset that little fun world of radio. We batted heads, bumped heads over the course of the past 5 or so years that it's been since I've been doing the show myself. And that is difficult because I do owe him a debt of gratitude. And thinking back, we did have a damn good time going through Boston and back down here to New York and whatnot. So, it was difficult.
Yeah, I think like a marriage, it doesn't always end nicely, unfortunately. But we're talking with Anthony Cumia, radio legend and author of Permanently Suspended, The Rise and Fall and Rise Again of radio's most notorious shock jock. Your book begs the question to me, and I've been thinking about this recently, where did all the shock jocks go? I mean, I know that you're on podcasting, some others maybe as well, but I feel like those big personalities that were, when I was a kind of a rabid radio listener in the 90s, they're not really there, or they don't have the prominence. Even Howard Stern is more known for his interviews now than anything else. Are we all shocked out? Is it even an unfair kind of label? Because I think people like you and Howard Stern are big talents, and I think that the term shock jock to me always feels like, oh, without the potty mouth, he's nothing. But I think your career kind of debunks that. What do you think of it, sort of that whole label itself, and where people like that have gone?
Yeah, that's really funny because I've thought about this over the years, and it's come up in conversation. It's such a weird title, shock jock, and it was a thing, especially 80s, 90s. Howard Stern, I think, is the epitome of the shock jock of the day. But there were plenty, and we definitely fell into that category as the Opie and Anthony show at the beginning, especially over there at AAF in Boston and early days of NEW in New York City. I think what happened was the internet had a lot to do with it. When you're talking about a girl naked in your studio, there's no visual. I mean, you have to paint that picture, and how outrageous certain things shock jocks did. We were doing just insane things. We were taking telephones and putting them in very intimate areas on certain ladies that would come into the studio to see if we could get a signal on the phone from internally, let's just say. And, that was shocking. I think with the internet, it's nearly impossible to shock anyone anymore. You can see in amazing 4K these days some of the most horrendous things you could possibly imagine. I think we become desensitized. It was always a thing. You think we'll be desensitized from the internet? You think people have seen too many things that they don't care anymore, and they can watch horrific things and then just go off and have dinner? I think they can. And I think that was the beginning of the end for the shock jock who's saying, wow, there's a girl and she's topless in the studio. Really? These days it just seems nostalgic and sweet. So I think that was part of the downfall. The other thing is it just got kind of old and saturated. You bring up a good point. I think the shocking things got the audience in. They got the masses of people to tune into your show. But when you weren't doing those shocking things, you had to be entertaining. You had to entertain people with stories and being funny, having comics that were genuinely funny, not just doing their act on the radio. That was a big thing on the O&A show. So I think people just got tired of an oversaturated radio market with these kind of hacky shock jocks.
Mm-hmm. Your book talks about how some of your comic friends kind of distanced themselves from you after the Sirius XM firing. I was kind of curious, you're right of center, generally speaking, maybe hard to pigeonhole directly, but has that cost you any kind of show business relationships or friends, that part of it? Because I know that can be very divisive at times.
Yeah, I think so. Early on, when I got the boot from Sirius XM, it's weird. It's like in Goodfellas, when he went to jail, it was like, Karen, I'm in jail. We got to take care of ourselves, Karen. Nobody's going to help us. And that's kind of how it is. you have to be by yourself and kind of succeed on your own for a little while. A lot of the comics came back on board and decided to hang out and do the show. But there are still some that I think shy away. Maybe it's I think it's all out of fear, again, and self-preservation. So I don't really call them out or blame anybody for it. I understand it. But I think political affiliation and political ideology comes into play too. Yeah. There are a few comics. I try very hard not to let people's politics interfere with how I see them and enjoy them as entertainers. But there are a few that I just can't get over that hurdle. And I'm sure there are a few comics and entertainers who feel the same way about me.
Yeah.
So, whether they respect me as an entertainer or not isn't even relevant at that point. It's just they look and go, ugh, this guy. And, since I've done the same thing with other people, I understand it.
Yeah. You have Compound Media now. Only you could fire yourself at this point. Is it everything you wanted at this point in your career? Is there something else you'd like to kind of strive for? Or is this sort of the sweet spot that maybe everything was winding up to?
It's weird because I really do kind of and did enjoy going into work, into a job that was somebody else's. Like I would go into all the radio stations we worked at or Sirius XM and sit down for 4 hours, do a show, and run out, go home, play video games, whatever the hell I want to do. So I never foresaw me as being the boss or the owner of a broadcast company online. So it was never a dream of mine to do this. I just thought I'd continue working for a company and doing a radio show or some type of broadcasting on a digital platform or whatever. But this kind of came out of necessity originally. I guess I could have retired. I could have, we've been lucky enough to have a very lucrative careers, Opie and myself. So I probably could have moved to Pennsylvania somewhere in the woods and shot guns and had fun. But there just is something about being able to get out there and entertain people. I don't know what it is. It's been there in me since I was a kid. So I knew I couldn't stop. I knew it would be very difficult to get another gig after the Sirius firing. So this was kind of a necessity, a lifeboat kind of a thing initially. How it grew into what it is now with, over 10 shows and growing, a studio in New York City. To me, I really look back and think, wow, I don't even know how we got here, but I'm very happy we are. And it's an adventure. It's frightening at times, but it's a perfect place for me to be right now in my life.
Gotcha. I was reading, I don't know if it was on the show or on the book, that you said you would have Anthony Weiner on as a show host, and you've been on InfoWars. You are the free speech guy at a time where free speech is sort of not cool or hip. Are there lines you do draw in that kind of universe, or is it everyone talk and go from there? Because I think even people who are pretty open, they do sort of kind of have their boundaries, and it's hard to see yours. And I don't mean it as a negative thing. It's an interesting part of who you are.
I am an absolutist when it comes to our freedom of speech, and not even the technically speaking constitutional First Amendment freedom of speech. I honestly think, aside from a government entity telling you what you can and can't say, and the fact that we have a First Amendment preventing that, I think everyone has an innate human right to be able to speak, to be able to give their points of view, to be debated, and regardless of who they are and where they come from and what they've done and anything else, I think giving somebody a platform to speak is never an endorsement of what they have to say. I don't know how it came to that. I would have anyone on Compound Media and allow them to speak and allow the public or anybody else to debate what they have to say, to call them out for things they've done or said. I am 100% against censoring people, exiling them, making it so they are silenced and never heard from again. It's some weird medieval kind of thinking to do that, put someone in an iron mask. So I honestly do not have a barrier. I don't have a line as far as who should or shouldn't be heard from. And again, the most important thing is it's not an endorsement. It's not an endorsement of someone's opinions to put them on my platform, on Compound Media. It's an opportunity for people to hear from somebody that they might be repulsed by and debate that or call it out instead of just silencing it. I think that's the most dangerous thing.
One last question, Anthony. You have kind of a unique perspective on broadcasting, podcasting, radio, you name it. Where do we go from here in the next 5 years as far as audio platforms? And we'll kind of just put them all in a bucket, because I feel like everything in our culture is changing so dramatically. I used to read the newspaper every day, and now I'm done. And that behavior from 30 plus years is gone. And I think even on TV, we used to have must-see TV. Now, if that show is not on this very second, I'm angry. So from your perspective, where do you think where does audio go from here? Is it sort of radio and podcasting kind of working side by side unevenly? Where do you see things headed? Because I just kind of curious.
It's interesting you bring that up, because just last night I was on YouTube watching videos of people in the 80s and 90s discussing the internet. And I honestly think in order to know where we're going, you have to see where we've been. I really believe that with a lot of things. So it was really enlightening to see how unprepared society was for the internet. There's some great news clips where they're talking about it, and you'll laugh. You're literally laughing. Me and my girlfriend were cracking up at how they're going, what is internet? They didn't know what this even was. And it's so hard to try to predict what it's going to be and where it's going. We have to be on that cutting edge, because you can fall behind in this day and age with electronic media very quickly. Myself and Keith Maresca, one of my producers, we were discussing that. We are a technical company and an entertainment company, which is weird. I'm used to just getting on mic and doing a show. We have to actually know how to deliver it to people. We have to know things about servers, and we have to know things about being paid online and distributing our product to the masses unimpeded by some electrical bugs or gremlins that are going to bite us in the ass. This is a whole new ballgame. And staying on the cutting edge of that technically, if you're doing a video show, we got to upgrade. You got to do 4K. The audio has to be good. You can't just throw on an Xbox headset mic and say you're doing a show anymore. It's got to be quality. So I think the delivery system is important, keeping up with that technology. But I think the biggest commodity is still good shows. And I think if you have that, people will seek you out regardless of the amount of platforms there are out there. You could go to anything and get 70s on 7, 80s on 8, things like that. But you can't just say, oh, let's get a talk show and put it on and just have a talk show. It's got to be a good one. You got to want to listen. It's got to be compelling. And that's the commodity in this day and age of so much stuff out there. So if you're doing a good show, people will search you out. And that's kind of a timeless thing. But you got to keep up to date on the technological end of it.
Yeah. Well, people have been searching you out for a pretty long time, and they're still doing it. Thanks again, Anthony, for joining the HiTcast. Please pick up his must-read memoir. It's a really good read. Permanently Suspended, for an essential look into radio, podcasting, and pop culture. And, of course, join Compound Media for more of Anthony Cumia and also his other irreverent podcasts. Anthony, it's a real pleasure to speak to you, and I wish you all the best.
Hey, thanks so much, man. Great talking to you.
Well, thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out HollywoodandToto.com for both the show notes and, of course, the latest entertainment news. Please follow me at Twitter at HollywoodandToto. And we'd love it if you leave a podcast review over at iTunes. See you next week.